Well, it is officially June and the weather temperatures are starting to warm up. The water temperatures are really warming up. The bass are in transition. And today I want to talk about that as well as my top 5 lures that I will not leave home without in June. So stay tuned. It's going to be a good one. This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. Recently, Sportsman's Outfitters had a pretty big Memorial Day sale, but no matter what, it seems like they always have some sort of deal or sale going on some of your favorite lures. And not only that, but they have really stepped up and really supported the Bass Fishing HQ channel. So the next time you go to shop for rods, reels, tackle of any sort, check out sportsmansoutfitters.com. You're going to greatly help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel. Now, no matter where you live in the country, one of the biggest things that happens in June is a lot of fish start moving to deeper structure and deeper cover in the lakes that you're fishing. Now, if you live way up in the northern part of the country, you're still gonna have fish that are on beds even in June, but sometime in June, they're going to start making that transition out to deeper water and really starting to get in their summertime patterns. If you can intersect those fish as they are moving out to you, you can find some of the biggest schools of fish. And not only are they big schools, but they are very catchable. They haven't been completely beaten up quite yet. They're just getting out to some of these areas. They're aggressive, and it can be a really, really fun time where you can go out and catch a ton of fish. Now, with that being said, I have a select number of lures that I'm literally not gonna leave home without. So let's dive into those lures right now. Now, if you had asked me what one of my favorite lures is in June over probably the last 10 years, I would have told you a deep diving crankbait. A deep diving crankbait can be an effective tool and you can catch fish on it in June, but I just feel that in a lot of lakes, bass have really gotten conditioned to a deep diving crankbait. It seems that if current is not present, it can be hard to catch them on a deep diving crankbait. Now, that's not always true. That's just kind of a general pattern that I've seen across the country in a number of different lakes. Now, with that being said, a lure that has really kind of replaced my crankbait is a swim bait, and specifically a jig head swim bait like the one that I have right here. One of the best things about a deep diving crankbait like this is you can cover a ton of water very, very efficiently. And you can do the exact same thing with the swim bait, but the difference is that the swim bait looks extremely natural to the fish, and I feel like I get a lot more bites on a swim bait like this than I do on the deep diving crankbait anymore. So this is actually the first lure of the 5 that I'm going to recommend. Now, depending on where you live in the country and what species of bass you are fishing for, you can kind of cater your swim bait to those fish. If you live up in the northern part of the country where you might be dealing with a lot of smallmouth, you might be throwing a really small swim bait, something that is 3.3 inches with maybe a 1/4 ounce weight. Now, if you live down south where you're fishing a lot of bigger impoundments that have bigger largemouth in them, you might be fishing, a 1/2 ounce or a 3/4 ounce swim bait with something like a 5 or 6 inch swim bait on the back. This swim bait right here is the Strike King Rage Swimmer. It's one of my favorite to use on the back of a jig head, and I will link everything down below in the description if you guys are interested in picking these things up. Most of the time I am fishing this on the bottom. I'm gonna make a very long cast out there. I'm gonna reel this kind of at a medium slow pace across the bottom. If you have some schools found out there, you can find them quickly with the swim bait. Now, there are times where bass are really going to suspend, especially right after the spawn. And if you have the forward facing sonar and the fancy equipment, you can actually target fish with a jig head swim bait like this that are suspended in the water column. But if you don't have those electronics, simply cast this thing off on offshore humps, ledges, rock piles, and do a slow to medium retrieve across the bottom, and you will catch a lot of fish on a swim bait in June. Now, the next lure is one that works absolutely everywhere. It works in ponds, rivers, lakes. It works in really shallow water. It works in really, really deep water, and it just so happens to be one of my favorite techniques ever, and that is fishing a big worm. June is one of the best times to fish big worms. I got a Zoom Old Monster worm here and a Zoom Magnum Trick worm here. There are a lot of days that we go out fishing anymore that bass just do not respond to moving lures. Although I love to catch them on that swim bait, sometimes you really have to slow down and drag something across the bottom in order to catch them. And that is when I'm going to pick up one of these big worms. Kind of a 1-2 punch that I do a lot is I will find fish with that swim bait, and then I will slow down and drag a worm through them and catch a lot of fish. Now, the best thing about that big worm is just how versatile it is. You know, there are certain lakes in the country where, you know, you're gonna be fishing a lot of offshore brush piles in June, and the big worm works great there. There are a lot of other lakes that have a ton of grass in them where you are fishing hydrilla or milfoil or coontail clumps. That is another great time to pick up this big worm because it's going to come through that cover exceptionally well. And there are other places where you are fishing shell beds and rock piles, and simply dragging this worm across the bottom, you're going to catch some of the biggest fish of your life in June. Now, there are two main ways that I rig these big worms. One is going to be the traditional Texas rig, and the other one is going to be on some sort of stand-up jig head. But no matter where you live in the country or how deep you're fishing, you should always have a big worm tied up in June. Now, speaking of worms, the next lure that you need to have tied up, lure number 3, is a drop shot. Now, I really like to fish a straight-tailed worm on my drop shot. That works really well for largemouth, smallmouth, or spotted bass. Now, there's a few times that I really love fishing a drop shot in June, and one is actually gonna be when I'm fishing up shallow. A lot of times, there's gonna be a group of fish that stays shallow even in June. But the thing about it is that a lot of guys have been fishing for those fish through March and April and May, and those fish have seen a lot of the more traditional lures like jigs, lures like Texas rigs. And so showing them a different presentation, something like a drop shot, you can actually catch fish behind guys on a drop shot when they're fishing more of those traditional style lures. So fishing a drop shot up shallow around cover, whether that's vegetation, wood, or rock, is a very effective way at catching fish during this time of the year. Now, on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, I also love to fish a drop shot extremely deep in the month of June. Something that a lot of guys may not know is that right after the bass spawn, kind of that immediate post-spawn, early summertime, this is the time of the year where you will find some of the deepest schools of bass that you will find. And one of the biggest reasons being is that there's really no thermocline that has started to develop yet. You know, as that thermocline develops later in the summer, it will actually push fish up shallower on that offshore structure. But this time of the year, during late May, early June, you don't have a thermocline. So those bass can get extremely deep and have a good quality water to live in. Now, with that being said, one of the most effective tools to fish in really deep water, 25, 30, 35, even 40 foot deep, is a drop shot. So always have that drop shot tied up. Now, the fourth lure is absolutely one of my favorite bites, and this is definitely a lure that a lot of guys put down by the time you get to June, and that is a jerkbait. There are so many guys out there, and I fall victim to this as well, that anytime I think about a jerkbait, I really think about fishing it in colder water. You know, water temperatures that are 30, 40, 50 degrees. But a jerkbait is still a really effective bait at catching bass in warmer water conditions as well. Something that we see a lot in kind of late May and early June is a shad spawn. And one of the best baits at mimicking a shad is a jerkbait. So if you find a shad spawn happening on the lake that you are fishing, don't forget about that jerkbait, because it's a bait that a lot of guys aren't throwing. And when you throw baits that guys aren't throwing, you catch fish that they aren't catching. Now, one of the biggest differences between a jerkbait that I fish in cold water versus a jerkbait that I fish in warmer water, I tend to fish jerkbaits that are floaters during warmer weather months. Jerkbaits that when you actually kill them, they will slowly rise up. When I fish in colder water, I actually like jerkbaits that slowly sink. But in the warmer weather months, I like those ones that float back. Now, one of the biggest reasons that I like that floating bait is it helps you to fish it around outside grass lines, which this is a big pattern that really develops in June, is fishing some of those outside grass lines. Whatever grass that may be, hydrilla, milfoil, coontail, pondweed, whatever it may be, if you can find an outside edge, a jerkbait is, again, it's a bait that a lot of guys put down this time of the year, and it still catches a lot of fish. Now, if you are fishing in the northern part of the country where there's a lot of smallmouth bass, you should almost always have a jerkbait, because them suckers absolutely love a jerkbait. Now, I actually saved my favorite June lure for number 5, and that is some sort of topwater bait. Now, whether you're fishing a walking bait, a popper, a plopper, a frog or a wake bait. During June, I feel like this is one of the best months to catch a really big fish on a topwater bait. Now, depending on what lake you are fishing and what type of cover you're fishing is really going to dictate which topwater that I choose. You know, if I'm making really, really long casts across a grassy point, I'm probably going to pick up some sort of walking bait. If I'm target fishing around stumps or grass patches, that might be a place where I pick up a popper. If I'm fishing around a lot of shoreline cover and matted vegetation, that's probably where I'm going to pick up a frog. But something that I find really interesting about fishing a topwater in June is I have seen specific days out on the water where the biggest bass on the lake that you're fishing are hitting topwater, and you will not catch them any other way. It's topwater or nothing at all. Now, when it comes to topwater fishing, you should really have the right equipment depending on what lure you have. And there are a lot of mistakes that I think just cost guys losing a lot of fish with a topwater. And I actually made a real specific video all about topwater mistakes that a lot of guys make that lose them a lot of bass. So if you guys enjoyed this video, I think you'll like this one as well. Don't forget to check out Sportsman's Outfitters, comment below, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.